Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk Weekly Parsha. This week, I'm going to try to say this, BeHaalotecha or BeHaalotecha. Depends on where you're from, I reckon, and how bad that interpretation of that was probably embarrassing. I'm not really sure. How are you doing, Rob? Good to see you back.
That's okay. I'm good. I used to have there was one time these friends of mine were staying at my house, and one of them says to me, "Oh, you got to watch this video." And he put a video on. I can't remember the guy's name. He was big in the Hebrew Roots movement. Brad something.
Brad Scott, probably.
No, it wasn't Brad Scott. It was another guy. Maybe I think his name was Brad. Anyway, so I said, "What's with that guy in the hillbilly Hebrew?" My friend laughed. And then I have my one friend. I've had a friend that when I used to do security back in the 90s in Israel, I did security at the Benyane Ha'uma. They used to do this big festival during Sukkot, and Christians would come from all over the world to it. And I was standing at the base of the in the auditorium, like down at the bottom of the stairs by the stage, and Prime Minister Rabin was coming in, and I was standing at the bottom. I have pictures, and a photographer came running out, coming at the Prime Minister as I was standing there. So I grabbed the guy and stopped him. I had him by the arms and whatever. And then afterwards, this guy came over to me, and he said, I was sitting in the front row with my wife, and I'm a chaplain with the Volusia County Sheriff's Department, and I was going to get up and come help you. And my wife grabbed me and said, "Do you really want to run up behind that guy while he's dealing with that?" He's a pretty big guy. So,
right. That's funny.
So he didn't. And so I say the one friend, he's a pastor, still a pastor. And anyway, when I called him and I said, because I looked this guy up that was speaking the hillbilly Hebrew, and it turns out that he was from the town where my friend had his church, where he was a pastor. And I say my one friend because he's the only one that I still have on Facebook. If you go to my Facebook, there are no missionaries or anything like that. Mike is very respectful of where I am and as a rabbi, and I'm respectful of him as a pastor. But I said, "Hey, Mike, I have a question for you. This guy is from your town. Do you know him?" And he goes, "He was my youth pastor."
That's funny. Oh my gosh.
So he had been his youth pastor, and Mike has always been supportive of Israel, and Mike actually, as much as his is hillbilly Hebrew too, he's at least better than this guy was. But so you're all right.
So there's a guy named the guy named Rabbi Nathan. He's a Messianic Christian, Nathan Schneider, I think, and
he's another one.
Even when we were Messianic, I thought his teachings were kind of neat, but the thing that I just couldn't keep hearing. He says "beloved" about every 6 words, and it was like driving me nuts. I was like, oh. Can I mute it during that one spot every time? If I could just time it, I'd know right when to mute it. But it was just kind of interesting. But yeah,
you always know, you can always tell somebody who has no background or did not grow up with this in the idea that they're incapable of pronouncing the sound.
Right.
So they would never be able to say BeHaalotecha.
Right.
They'll say BeHaalotecha.
Right.
Or, when you hear them say a bracha, a brakot, or, it's always that inability to say that.
Right.
Whereas when you grow up with this, it's just second nature. I mean, you don't think about it. It just comes out that way. But it's BeHaalotecha.
BeHaalotecha. Right.
Yeah.
Very good.
So, or if you're doing, like you said, the Ashkenazi pronunciation, it would probably be BeHaalotecha.
Right. So that's where we're at. Yeah. That is Devarim. No. 8
numbers.
Something. I mean, number. Yeah, Bamidbar. Thank you. 8:1 through 12:16. I think it is. So
right.
Cool. So what is the underlying overall message, if you could say, this Parsha is about blank?
I don't know that it's one of those parshiot that it's not specifically one thing, although it's named after the idea of Aharon going up and lighting the lamps. We're at the stage now where the Mishkan has been erected by Moshe Rabbeinu, and now there are these instructions being given as to how the Kohanim are to do their jobs, and specifically Aaron, the Kohen HaGadol. And so BeHaalotecha is this idea of when you go up to light the lamps or trim the lamps, and everything from a spiritual standpoint really comes down to the idea of illumination. Okay. Now, I find this a very interesting parsha all the time, as I do most, because the Torah is so amazing. But when you're talking about the concept of illumination, and not just illumination, but when we're talking about illumination in Judaism and the very spiritual side of things, when you look at it from a Kabbalistic standpoint, we're talking about illumination as it relates to consciousness, the idea of having consciousness. And I think maybe we'll talk probably more deeply about this next week when we get into Shalach. Now, it's interesting that you and I had a little bit of a confusion. And this happens sometimes so that people know, in the same way that sometimes you open up the Torah and you're looking at certain parshiot and you see that there's a difference between like the Hebrew chapters and verses and the English. So for instance, you might look at people who came out of Christianity, for instance, might look at a Christian version of the Bible and the chapters and verses are off. In other words, there might be the English version says, whatever, chapter 8, verse 12, but in the Hebrew, it's chapter 8, verse 10.
Right.
So we see a similar kind of thing in that. So yesterday here in Israel, I go to a very small Beit Knesset, which Beit Knesset is the Hebrew for synagogue or shul. Would be house of assembly, sort of, in the literal translation. So I go to Beit Knesset, and it's a small one. So typically, because it's a small one, when the Torah is brought out, I typically almost every week I'm called up for an aliyah, an aliyah to the Torah, where I get called up to the Torah and say the brachot and so I know when I got called up to the Torah yesterday, we were on BeHaalotecha. And typically you and I do the next week's Parsha. Right. So for us in Israel is BeHaalotecha yesterday, which means that next week for us will be Shalach. But for you, BeHaalotecha will be the Shabbat. So this happens sometimes where there's a difference in the Parsha that's read in Israel as opposed to what we call the diaspora outside of Israel. And then what ends up happening is we make it up. Either we make it up here or you make it up outside of Israel based on there being a single Parsha that's read, or when you have the double Parshiot that are read. Eventually we come to even out at certain times of the year. So this is one of those times where we're actually a week ahead of you guys.
Right.
So anyway, BeHaalotecha is much more interesting to me this year because of everything that's going on. We can't get away from the idea that we've been talking for weeks and weeks, maybe months now, since the beginning of the COVID-19 situation. And now we have this terrible thing that took place in the U.S. with the death of George Floyd, which was a terrible, terrible thing, a disgusting thing. It should have never happened. But then we have all of these riots going on and looting going on. And for the most part, I know people are saying that for the most part, the protests are peaceful. But there's obviously there's an agenda out there. There's and for sure there are policies that need to be changed, and certainly racism of any type. And nobody has to tell the Jewish people about these kind of things, about the changes, because we've been dealing with anti-Semitism for thousands of years. And of course, we're being blamed for this again. There was a news report the other day. I don't know if you saw it. A friend of ours posted it on Facebook that one news report called them Mazel Tov cocktails.
What the heck? Wow.
Instead of Molotov cocktails.
That's funny.
So it's like, once again, the Jews get, we're getting blamed like a blood libel for the virus, for COVID-19, and now we're getting blamed for Mazel Tov cocktails. So nobody has to be told about that. But so here's the thing here's the interesting thing. When you look at the BeHaalotecha in the Zohar, and I just happened to be obviously learning this on Shabbat because this was the portion for us this week. It's very interesting to note that you just asked me what is the main theme. So it's named after this idea of going up and trimming the lamb. So yet in the Zohar, BeHaalotecha starts off with a completely different, it starts off with that verse at the beginning of Numbers chapter 8, verse 1, where it says, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el Aharon va'amata alav BeHaalotecha et hanerot, this idea of speak to Aaron and say to him when he kindles the lamps. And then it goes into this, so it brings that in the Zohar, but then it goes into a completely different concept, and it really hits home the idea of the fact that we've been given a Torah of truth. That the Torah is a tree of life. It's an Eitz Chaim, but it's also a Torah of truth. And it talks about illumination in the sense of the sun, that the sun sort of brings the light. One of the things that we learn, not just in a Kabbalistic sense, but in general, but we know that there was in the sources that there was kind of an argument that went on between the sun and the moon, because you had these two great lights that Hashem created. And the moon was kind of upset at the fact that, it was going to be a lesser light to a certain degree. And so you have a situation now where the moon, when you look at the moon doesn't have any illumination of its own. It isn't lit by anything other than the sun. So it receives its light from the sun. So even though you're seeing the moon appearing to be lit at night, it's not being illuminated in and of itself. It's only illuminated from the sun. This speaks to the world that we live in, because the world we live in Kabbalah and in the Eitz Chaim and the Tree of Life is said to be the world of Malchut, which is the lowest Sphira. And Malchut also has no illumination of its own. It only receives illumination from above. Now, so I think it's interesting that the way BeHaalotecha starts in the Zohar is this idea where it describes this beginning of this illumination as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber. And then the very next section of the Zohar, the very next section after it talks about this idea of the Torah being a tree of life and a Torah of truth, and it basically tells us that when we study Torah, when we learn Torah, that basically what we do is we inherit life. We inherit life in this world, and we inherit life in the world to come. And then it goes in, and the next section, like I started to say, speaks about the idea of, it actually says, Rabbi Abba Patach, Rabbi Abba opens, and he says, Ashrei ha'am yodei truah Hashem be'or panecha yehalechon. This idea, quoting a verse from Tehillim, chapter 89, verse 6, that says, happy is the people that know the joyful note. They shall walk, O Hashem, in the light of your countenance. And it's that note when it says Ashrei ha'am yodeh TORAH. This TORAH is the sound of the shofar. The joyful note is the joyful sound or the joyful shout, or however you want to translate it, is related to the shofar, the blowing of the shofar. And then the very next thing that goes in, and this was the point that I wanted to get to, is the very next section of the Parsha of BeHaalotecha. And why I'm bringing this up is because when we start talking about everything that's going on, when we start talking about the protests and the looting and burning down stores and the rioting and the violence, destroying property and violence against police officers and law enforcement and so forth, we've been talking about the idea, I think I mentioned over the last few weeks, the idea of barking dogs, that there are all kinds of voices out there that we hear dogs barking when we were talking about conspiracy theories, when we were talking about all the things that people are doing to scare people, that we even have rabbis out there that are, rather than bringing unity, rather than bringing achdut, they're causing division through promoting fear, promoting these conspiracy theories and so forth. And then you have things devolving even further into what we're seeing now at the protests and the violence and so forth. So what is this? How does this relate to this next section? So the very next section, after we see the idea of the Torah being a Torah of life and a Torah of truth and bringing illumination and related to the sun, sending down light and illuminating this world below in Malchut. And then we see this idea of happy is the people that hear the TORAH, this joyful sound. They're the ones that are going to walk with Hashem and in his countenance. The very next thing, William, that it talks about is the idea that the ark, the teva, the ark of Noah's ark, how it rested on Mount Ararat. That's what the Zohar brings. Of all the things to talk about related to BeHaalotecha, this idea of going up and kindling these lamps, it talks about that idea of Noah's Ark. And this is what it does. It recounts a story. It says Rabbi Elazar, for Rabbi Yossi, for Rabbi Yitzchak are basically walking along. These are three rabbis. When we see Rabbi Elazar, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's son. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai being the author of the Zohar. There's a famous story about Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar being in the cave for many years, and this is when he was given the Zohar, the inspiration for these very deep teachings. And so they're walking along, and suddenly they come upon these, it calls them like mountains of darkness, lofty mountains of darkness as they're walking along. And it says Rabbi Elazar lifts up his eyes and he says, basically, if my father was here, I wouldn't be afraid. I wouldn't be frightened, meaning that if his father, Rabbi Shimon, was there. But he says, because the three of us are speaking about the Torah amongst us, there's no judgment that can prevail over us. So it's talking about this concept of how important it is to always be studying and always be learning Torah. And then it says, Petach Reb Elazar v'amar kativ v'tanach v'hativa v'chodesh hashvi'i, talking about this idea that the ark rested in the seventh month. It's quoting from Genesis chapter 8, verse 4, where it says, and the ark rested in the seventh month upon the mountains of Ararat. And then it talks about, again, it keeps talking about how important and how beloved the words of Torah are. And then it talks about a concept that we learn in Torah that we even, as part of our daily prayers, where we talk, there's a section in the Birkat HaShachar, in the morning blessings, that says, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Rabbi Yishmael said, and it goes into the 13 principles of Torah study. It goes into this idea of specificity, that there are exceptions or specifics versus general rules. It's a concept in how we learn Torah. And it's really meant to bring a point. It's bringing a point about the idea that we can never just look at the Torah, and you and I talk about this often, the idea that you can never just look at the Torah, and of course there's pshat. We know that there's the simple meaning of a verse when we read it in the Torah, but then we know that there's the concept of pardes, the idea of the orchard. We have pshat, remez, drash, and sod, the idea of these different levels going all the way down to sod, which is the very deep secret levels that we learn about in Kabbalah. So what it's saying is that when you're talking about this concept of a specific or an exception versus a rule, it's really coming to teach us that you can't just look at things in a very simplified manner, that there's always a deeper connection to these things. And it brings, for an example, that, for instance, it uses an example in the next little section here. It basically says, in talking about the Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, writing about certain things in the Torah, that if it was just about simple matters, it basically says, such as talking about the words of Esav, or the words of Hagar, or the words of Lavan to Yaakov, or the words of the mule, or the words of Bilaam, or the words of Balak, or Zimri, all of these people who are really considered at a very low level, and in some ways considered wicked or evil, then we wouldn't have the kind of lofty, elevated Torah that we're talking about. And yet it goes into the idea in quoting Tehillim again in chapter 19, verse 8, where it says that the Torah of Hashem is perfect, the testimony of Hashem is sure, the statutes of Hashem are right or straight, the commandment of Hashem is pure, the fear of Hashem is clean, the judgments of Hashem are true. More desired are they than gold, even much more than fine gold. And so it's talking about the difference between very simple matters and very lofty matters. But then what does it have to do with this idea of the mountain of Ararat and this idea of the ark resting there? And this is what it says after it talks about all those things, all of those lofty things, those lofty concepts about the words of Hashem and as it relates to the Torah. It says, Tachaza, come and behold, come and see. And it says, when it says, V'tanach hateva, that the ark rested, it says that basically, and I'll tell you what rather than reading the Aramaic, I'll just tell you what the English translation would be. It basically says that when the ark rested, at the moment that judgment hangs upon the world and judgment prevails, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, sits on the throne of judgment to put the world on trial. And it says through that throne, there are all kinds of things recorded, like notes that are recorded on it. And it asks the question, how many judgments or verdicts are stored in it, in the bag of the king? And it goes on, it says, all the open books were stored there, and therefore nothing was forgotten by the king. And then it says this, which really struck me. It says that throne is not ready and is not available except during the 7th month. Then is the day of judgment, a day in which all the people in the world are counted and everyone passes before that throne. Hence the idea of Tanakh Hateva, the ark rested. And what does it say? It rested in the 7th month, most certainly the 7th month, which is when the judgment of the world comes. That really hit me like a ton of bricks when I read this over Shabbat. Because I'm really concerned about what's going on in the world. And I'm really concerned about what I see. And I really can't get off of this subject. I've been on it for quite a number of weeks even when we do our radio show and I talk about this. Mm-hmm. Because I am concerned about everybody. I'm concerned about myself. I'm concerned about my wife. I'm concerned about you and your family. I'm concerned about all of us and how we're responding rather than reacting, how we're responding to the things that are going on in the world. I'm concerned because I see crazy things being shared. We talk about this all the time on social media. I expect people that are not connected to the Torah, people who are connected to the world, I expect them to be caught up in the whirlwind of these things. I expect people that are not connected to Hashem, that don't have faith, that are faithless. I expect them to react to things and not to respond. But when I start to see people that are observant Jews, rabbis, observant, and I'm not saying rabbis are, they're human beings too. I'm just saying in general, because people tend to look at us and have sort of expect more from us or have respect for us or honor us in some way. But we're all fallible human beings. The point that I'm trying to make is that I expect that from the Erev Rav, from the mixed multitude, from the people that are wicked, for the people that have no connection, but people who are observant, people who are B'nai Noach, people who are connected to Hashem, people who want to keep Torah, that I'm seeing getting caught up in this whirlwind, don't see this. Now, what jumped out at that? I said a lot of things in there, but the most specific thing that I said and the most important thing to get out of this, when we're talking about this concept of the ark resting and connecting it to the 7th month, when we're talking about Yom Hadin, the day of judgment, that's talking about Rosh Hashanah. When we start hearing about the Torah is true, the Torah of life, and then we see the progression too is the people who hear the truah, the sound of the trumpet, the sound of the shout, talking about the shofar, and then it goes into this idea of the ark in the 7th month. What does it say here? It talks about the throne of judgment, but I don't know if you caught what I said. What I said was the throne is not ready and is not available except during the 7th month. It doesn't say that the throne is not being prepared or the throne is not built. It says the throne is not ready and it's not available till the 7th month. Now, what does that mean? We've talked all through the months about the importance of elevation, the importance of the Mishkan, the idea that Hashem says, build a Mishkan so that I may dwell in them or amongst them. And this whole idea of elevating, the whole idea that in Pesach, that when we came to Pesach, we said that Pesach is the highest night of the year. It's considered crazy illumination on Pesach. It's believed in Judaism that anything you want on Pesach you can ask for because you're at this very high level. And then what happens the next day? We go from having been at this very high level of, say, like the 50th gate of purity. We're now back down to where we were when we were taken out of Mitzrayim, when we were at the 49th level of impurity, where Hashem had to save us so that we weren't completely lost. And then what do we do in order to elevate ourselves? We have the counting of the Omer during those 49 days. And we come to this high level of Shavuot, of receiving the Torah, which we just did recently. And now here we are again. And it says that the throne is not ready and is not available save during the 7th month. then is the day, then is Yom Hadin, the day of judgment, in which all people in the world are counted and everyone passes before that throne. So you know what I thought about? This is funny. You'll appreciate this being from Texas.
Okay.
You like Westerns, William?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. You like Westerns like me. I grew up with Roy Rogers and Tonto. I grew up with the Westerns and certainly the spaghetti Westerns. You know what I thought about? This is the picture that came into my mind. I was sharing this with Leah over Shabbat when we were learning this. And she may go into this, some of these concepts in the show that she does with you guys, with Julie, when she does Women's World. I'm not going to give that up. Let her talk about that. But okay. We talked about this. Here's the picture that came up in my mind. You know how the guy is in the jail, he's in the jailhouse. The sheriff locks him up in the jail cell, and he has that little window that he can look out.
Oh, yeah.
And he sees the gallows being built. He can see the gallows being built because he's getting ready at some point to go meet the hangman on the gallows. Because whatever, he was a horse thief or whatever in those days. Being a horse thief was almost as bad as murder. Right. They would hang you for being a horse thief. And that's what I thought about. I had this picture in my mind that here's this guy in prison, and all he can do is look out this little window, and it's inevitable. He knows that the gallows being built, and he knows the gallows being built for him, and he knows eventually he's going to stand there, and he's going to be judged by the hangman. Now, I'm not suggesting chas v'shalom that I'm calling Hashem the hangman, but I'm just using this as a mashal, as a picture, as a parable of what I'm talking about. Because when it says that throne is not yet available, it's not ready and it's not available, it doesn't mean that the throne is not being prepared.
Right. Good point. Mm-hmm.
It says that eventually we're going to stand Yom Hadin on the day of judgment, and not just those of us that are connected to Torah, not just those of us that are connected to Hashem, but it says the whole world passes before that throne on that day. So what I'm suggesting before anything else, before we discuss anything else related to BeHaalotecha, is this idea that we recognize that before we get involved in the whirlwind of what's going on in social media and in the world related to protests and looting, and I'm not suggesting that anybody listening to the show is out there protesting or anybody is out there looting or burning stores down, but what I do see is people buying into crazy things. I see them focusing on the wrong things. It's great that you want to support a fight against racism. It's great if you want to, and I say, don't just support a fight against racism, support a fight against any downtrodden populations, support organizations that fight anti-Semitism, support organizations that fight racism. But a lot of people are supporting an organization that are out there that are in the forefront of this protest that is one of the most anti-Semitic organizations out there today. I may take flack for this, but the truth is that the Black Lives Matter movement is supportive of BDS. It's anti-Israel. It's anti-Zionism. It's anti-Jewish. That doesn't mean I'm a racist because I'm against Black Lives Matter. The Jewish people need to remember, before they come against the Jews in this, is to go back and look at what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about Israel and what he spoke about the Jewish people, and about the fact that the Jewish people and rabbis were the ones that were marching arm in arm with Dr. King. And I'm old enough to remember that. Those days. I know we use the term rolling over in his grave. Dr. King, if he was not already a great tzaddik, and, regardless of what his faith was, if you want to believe that his soul returned to its source in Hashem, then I would say that he would be turning over in his grave at the way certain movements are now anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, and so forth, because that was not his message. If you go on and Google him and see the things that he spoke about. So I'm suggesting that people take a step back. People have way too much time. People are contacting me privately and are saying, how come we don't see you posting on Facebook anymore? And I decided that I'm not posting anything other than our shows and nothing but Torah and positivity. I'm not getting caught up in the arguments. I'm not getting caught up in the fights. I open up my Facebook, my social media, and I bite my tongue every day because I see the most ridiculous things. I see Orthodox Jewish people. I see Jewish people using references to the Shoah and comparing political figures to people from the Shoah, and it disgusts me. People used to ask me back in the day if, I guess the biggest, most popular TV show at the time was Jerry Seinfeld. And people would reference that show, and I'd say, I don't know, I don't watch it. And they'd ask me why. And I'm not going to say why, but anybody that knows what I'm talking about, when I talk about this idea of using references to the Shoah, how it disgusts me, then you'd probably know why I never watched that show. Because here you have a Jewish guy that's using a reference to the Shoah in talking about a specific character on the show. I just find those things so offensive that people would even make those kind of comparisons. So what I'm trying to say is that when we think about this idea of the Mishkan, and we're thinking about this idea of elevation, and we're thinking about this idea that everything that we learn from Torah is about this concept of us being kind of making this world a place where the divine presence, where the presence of Hashem can dwell, and it's all about illumination and elevation, and that we keep going up to these levels and then kind of falling and then elevating ourselves again, that here we are in this Parsha of BeHaalotecha, and we're reading this in the Zohar. We're like those people. You have to see yourself, again, it's just a picture in your mind, but you have to see yourself in this picture as being the guy that's in that prison looking out at that little window. And okay, it's not a gallows, but it's a throne that's being prepared.
Right.
And every year, people think Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim is the Day of Atonements. That's the final, when the judgment is finished, when the books are closed, when we come to the final service. It's called Nilah, or what we call the closing of the gates. That's when we believe in Judaism, when it's done. But in the days of awe, starting in Rosh Hashanah with Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment, we need to be people now that look and realize that not yet, it's not available yet, it's not ready yet, but it's going to be ready in the 7th month, and that's not that far off from now. We're in June. We're only a few months away from that 7th month, when that throne is going to be prepared, and when every single one of us is going to go before Hashem and be judged. And what do you want to be judged on? Do you want to be judged on what we're talking about at the beginning, that this is a Torah of truth and a Torah of life? Or are you going to be the people that want to be like people that are uttering simplified things like the words of Esav, the words of Lavan to Yaakov, the words of Bilaam, the words of the mule, and so forth? Or do you want to be the people that recognize that the Torah of Hashem is perfect, the testimony of Hashem is sure, the statutes of Hashem are right, the commandment of Hashem is pure, the fear of Hashem is clean, and the judgments of Hashem are true? Then take a step back and realize that it's not available yet, but it's going to be.
Right.
So that's my rant for today.
Cool.
On that, I don't know. With about 15 to 18 minutes left, I could have. There's a lot more that I could say.
Right. Of course.
I don't know that I'm going to say much more about that. Okay. I think
Right.
I made my point.
I'll give you something to talk about if you want.
Go ahead.
So the menorah has in the instructions on how it should be built or placed. It gives you the imagery of the lower lights, the 6 on the outside of the main center one, are actually kind of pointing in towards the center,
Yeah.
the center one. And I've heard some pretty interesting midrash on that. But is there anything in particular you'd like to discuss?
Well, I always think that it was very interesting that several years ago, my wife and I were talking about this. We were talking about BeHaalotecha, and she said to me that she had been thinking about it, and she sort of got this picture in her head of the menorah being circular. And that for her, she kind of saw it as circular, where you had the center, the shamash, the center candle, and then the other 6 circling it and also pointing in. The same way we see in the description that you're talking about, where you have the center one and then you have the 6 that kind of look like they
line up
pointing in this way. She saw them circular. And then I did some research on it, and I actually found a source that described it exactly the way she did. Now, it's not the majority opinion.
Right.
But there is there was an opinion in Chazal, in the sages, that talked about the possibility that the menorah could potentially be in like that as well, where it was this idea of
kind of like the planets circling the sun in a way.
Yeah,
or
pretty
excuse
much.
me, yeah.
So all right, so when we think about this and the idea, and I've talked about this as well, and we've talked about this in the past, and so it's relevant to the concept of BeHaalotecha as well, is this idea of that the concept of the word Torah coming from a combination of the concept of or, light, and hora'ah, instruction.
Mm-hmm.
So again, kind of I'm stuck on this Kabbalistic thing today. So we could say that from Kabbalah that we're looking to receive instruction from the light.
Nice.
And what is the light? We have instruction from the light. There's not a duality with Hashem, but we often talk about the Ein Sof and the Or Ein Sof, where one is talking about the Ein Sof, meaning without end, or the infinite one, and then the Or Ein Sof, the light of the Ein Sof. And usually when you see, that's why I'm saying there's no duality, so I want to make that clear to people. But when you're talking about it, really what you're talking about is Hashem, the infinite one, and then the Or Ein Sof would be the Ratzon, the will of Hashem, would act as the Or Ein Sof. So what we're looking to do is we're always looking to connect to the will of Hashem, okay, the Ratzon, the Or Ein Sof, and that's what we're looking to learn from. We're trying to receive instruction from the will of Hashem. And like we said, the very beginning of this Parsha talks about this idea of kindling the menorah, where it says, and Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to Aharon and say to him, when you light the lamps, the 7 lamps shall cast their light toward the face of the menorah. And that's what it says, that it will cast its light towards the face. And then it says, and Aaron did so, he lit the lamps towards the face of the menorah, as Hashem had commanded Moshe. That's Numbers chapter 8, verse 1 through 3. Now, according to Midrash, when Aaron lit the menorah in the Mishkan, that basically Hashem promised that its light would shine forever. In the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, the flame of the menorah burned continuously. They had it burning constantly, and the thing that we have today is that if you walk into any Beit Knesset or you walk into any shul or synagogue, however you call it, there's something called the Ner Tamid, like just above the Aron, where the ark is, where the Sifrei Torah are held, right, where the holy Torot are, you have a Ner Tamid. Ner Tamid being an eternal flame. It's not a flame today.
Symbolic.
It's usually some kind of bulb that looks like it flickers,
right,
like a flame, but it's a light that stays on all the time, and that's representative of that concept of the menorah from BeHaalotecha that's supposed to burn continually.
Nice.
And so if we go back and we think about something that I said at the very beginning, which I said we'll probably go into much more deeply next week when we get into Shalach, and just to kind of give you a foretaste of it, I can tell you that in the way that we're talking now about BeHaalotecha, and we're only dealing with the very beginning of the Parsha. When we talk Shalach next week, we're going to be dealing with the very end of the Parsha. And when we talk about the idea of illumination, or more importantly, the concept of consciousness, we're going to be talking about the tzitzit. And we're going to connect the concept of the tzitzit, these tassels or fringes that we wear on the four corners of our garments, these things. And it says to put a string of techelet, which is the blue string, which you can see here, the blue string. And you see that the blue is wrapped around, going all the way down, and then the one blue string, it's called Petil Techelet. You'll see that in Numbers chapter 15. I believe it's verse 37 through 41, which is at the very end of the Parsha of Shalach. The lighting sort of represents, and this idea of ascending, when we look at it in the spiritual sense of Aaron basically ascending, going up, it's the process, we could say, or the action that takes place when we elevate the levels of consciousness. And what are we trying to elevate the levels of consciousness to? We're trying to elevate the levels of consciousness to that understanding, that an awareness of Hashem, an awareness of the Ratzon, the will of Hashem, and the aspect of Hashem's love, because there is no greater thing than Hashem's love when you're talking about Hashem's will, because it could only be through his desire to be good and his desire to do good, and out of a desire of love to create the world in the first place, or to create the universe, then create this world, and then create us in this world. You can only say that Hashem desired to give good and to do good to his creation, and that could only be through the concept of love. So this is one of the things that we want to do, is we want to elevate that. Now, one of the things that we talked about in this idea of the Torah being all of these things, being perfect, and the testimony of Hashem sure, and the statutes of Hashem being straight or right, and the commandment of Hashem being pure, and the fear of Hashem being clean, and the judgments of Hashem are true. And then we said, what does it say? It says, more to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold. Again, quoting from Tehillim, from Psalm 19, verse 8 through 11. And what do we know about the menorah? When we're talking about this elevation, this illumination, receiving a light from the Torah, it says that it's made from gold. We've talked about this in the past as well. The gold symbolized the finest and most precious quality in the material world. There are a few things that are. I mean, most people know. Okay, people might look at diamonds as being the most precious, but really, for the average person, most people see when they're thinking about quality and something that's precious in the material world, the first thing that people think about is gold. And of course, we know that in Exodus chapter 35, when we have a description of the construction of the menorah, we know that it was made not only of gold, but it's said to have been made from a single piece of gold. Now imagine that. Imagine the size of the piece of gold that you had to have in order to make the menorah.
And that was not melting it together to make a larger piece. It was literally...
that was not melting it together. No, it's like the only thing that I can describe it as is 1 year I had the merit of being able to travel to Italy. And on the way back, we stayed in Florence for a few days. And we were able to go to the museum in Florence where Michelangelo's David is. And many other works of Michelangelo are there. David in itself is an amazing piece. But you know what really struck me was that there were pieces there of Michelangelo's that were only half completed, that they had on display. it really spoke to the genius of how somebody could look at a large stone and draw out from that stone. Like, in other words, you have to have a picture in your mind of what you're going to pull out of that big piece. It's the same thing when you think about the wisdom and the knowledge that Hashem had to impart to people like Betzalel, to the craftsmen that were doing these things. There was somebody, okay, they had instructions, but then as a human being, you had to have this picture in your mind of this huge piece of gold and how you were going to draw out this menorah from the instructions that Hashem gave. I mean, that is stupendous when you think about it. The wisdom that Hashem had to impart to somebody in order for them to be able to produce that. That's the only thing. Sometimes I don't know about you, but I need like real world examples to look at to in my mind to go, how is that possible? Like, how could anybody think of this? The only thing that like I said, the only thing in the real world that I've ever seen that shows that kind of genius is somebody like Michelangelo. And you have to believe that, when you see, things like whether you agree with it, whether you agree with his belief system or not, when you look at the Sistine Chapel, you look at some of the things this guy did, there's no way that it wasn't inspired by Hashem. Yeah. Okay. So maybe he didn't have the right belief system, but it definitely, was connected in that way.
Something else I heard was there's an opinion also on the shape of the menorah that that could have very well been in a V shape as opposed to the U shape on the limbs.
You mean this way?
Yep, correct.
Yeah.
Something to do with the confusion about the Arch of Titus and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. But that's the beauty of it. We're never going to know. It's very interesting when you learn Talmud. There are often times when you're, for those people that are studying Daf Yomi, that study the daily Daf in the Talmud, you find these things all the time. That there are often times when you go through Sugya, you go through this whole section of Talmud with the Mishnah, the law, and then you go through the Gemara, and you have all these different opinions, and then it says, what's the answer at the end of the day? And it says Tiku. What does Tiku mean? It's basically telling you that there is no answer, and we won't know until Eliyahu Hanavi, meaning that basically we won't know the answer to that question in the Gemara until the Mashiach comes. There are just some of those things like that. And I think sometimes that's one of them. A thing like this, how the menorah really looked, is one of those things. It's going to be Tiku. We really don't know until Mashiach comes back and shows us what it was like.
Right. Indeed. Well,
I don't know that maybe we should end it there.
Okay.
I know we have a couple of minutes, but I want to save some for next week.
Sure. No worries at all. Cool. Well, all right. Well, it's definitely been fun. I love talking about the weekly Parsha. So, and for you,
well, I talked about the weekly Parsha. You basically listened.
Yeah.
Until
I do a lot of listening. I usually get about 10 to 12 hours average a week, mainly from Chabad because they got such easy resources to reach out to from different rabbis and learn a lot of stuff. One of my favorite rabbis, he's a late rabbi. Yehoshua Gordon. I think the reason why I liked him so much is because he always read the Hebrew and then he would translate it like a half a sentence at a time. And so not only were you getting Torah, but you're also learning Hebrew as you go along. It's really cool. So, which is something that you can do when you're listening, at home. But doing a show like this, if I did that, we'd never get past. Well, you're right. And to clarify, to listen to his.
By the way, I thought I was one of your favorites.
You are one of my favorites. But to clarify what you just said, though, is so true because on his podcast that he did, it wasn't just one a week. He actually did like 7. Had 7 parts per week because it was just like one part would take like 30 minutes just to blow through it really fast. So, yeah. So if you sit there, I guess entirely and did the entire thing, it'd probably take 3 hours or so for him to go through it, doing both the English and Hebrew at that pace. So,
look, if I really, like, for instance, in a Parsha like Shalach next week, I probably have enough to talk about just about the tzitzit, where we could probably do 3 hours.
No kidding. That's crazy. Cool. Well, very good, Rabbi. Well, listen, I had a great time, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Actually, I'll see you tomorrow again for Israel News Talk Radio, Science of Kabbalah. For all of you who haven't tuned in there yet, you should definitely check it out. Airs Tuesdays at some time.
And yes, 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern time. But you want to also check out Tanakh Talk and Women's World tomorrow with...
Go ahead.
My lovely wife, Leah.
Yep. And
Julie.
Yeah. Awesome team for sure.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, folks, y'all have a great day and a great week, and more shows lined up. I think the next show right now is actually set up for 4:30 p.m. with Rabbi Michael Skobac. And just to clarify, I've got more shows on the agenda. They just haven't started yet, like Hebrew Grammar with Lon Cherryholmes. That is going to come to you. Why does my glasses look all funky? Anyway, it's going to the schedule for that will be from 2 to 3 on Sundays, and then there's a 3:30 to 4. I'm trying to squeeze out a little 30-minute inset program there too, so we can kind of have a full schedule again there. So 4:30 and then 6 p.m. With Rabbi Moshe Shulman, and then tomorrow a full day. So we look forward to seeing you guys in. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on notifications, and if you're not getting notifications and you don't know when we're going live, then send me a friend request on Facebook, and you want to follow me, because if you're not following me, then you won't see my posts when I put them up. So those are more options for you. So guys, thank you again once, and we'll see you next week. Shavua Tov, everybody.